An Undeceptions podcast. How does one learn? It's a question we often ask ourselves at Undeceptions because learning is key to being undeceived, to letting the truth out. But in education circles, there are many different approaches to learning. There are cognitive and constructivist theories, behaviourist approaches, social learning theories, and neurological and biological studies, just to name a few. But let's zero in for a moment on what's called the zone of proximal development. In the 1930s, a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky suggested that true learning occurs when students are supported by a, quote, more knowledgeable other. The zone of proximal development, let's call it ZPD for short, is the distance between what someone can and can't do on their own. The ZPD is the sweet spot for learning. Picture this. Picture a child trying to solve a puzzle. If the child solves the puzzle without any troubles, no learning occurs. But if the child can't make any progress, even with hints, then the only thing likely to occur is frustration. But what happens when you introduce a more knowledgeable other, like a teacher or another child who's tackled this problem before? Studies show that with that bit of prompting or modelling, the original child is much more likely to experience true learning. In 1976, Wood, Bruner and Ross carried out the famous scaffolding study, where teachers were helping young children build pyramids out of blocks. Tutors adjusted their support depending on each child's level of competence, and help was slowly reduced as the kids gained skill. The teacher's experience provided the scaffold to support the student's learning. A lot of Undeceptions is about interacting with those more knowledgeable others to help us, including me, to fill in that zone of proximal development. In this episode, though, you might be surprised who our more knowledgeable others are. We have our expert guest, of course. That's one more knowledgeable other. But my guest suggests there are plenty of others who can provide the scaffold to all sorts of learning. If you're someone like me, who often really frets, that there are just too many things I don't know, and I long to shrink that ignorance gap, then this episode may just provide some signposts and supplies for the journey. I'm John Dickson, and this is Undeceptions. This season of Undeceptions is sponsored by Zondervan Academic. You can get discounts on their special Master Lectures video courses and free chapters of many of the books we talk about here on the pod. Just go to zondervanacademic.com/Undeceptions. Every episode of Undeceptions, we explore some aspect of life, faith, history, science, culture, or ethics that's either much misunderstood or mostly forgotten. With the help of people who know what they're talking about, we're trying to undeceive ourselves and let the truth out. My guest today begins the book he's written with a quote from Alvin Toffler, author of Future Shock. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Learning is at the centre of what my guest has to say. The Reverend Dr. A.J. Swoboda is the Associate Professor of Bible and Theology at Bushnell University in the beautiful state of Oregon. He's taught at a range of institutions, from the London School of Theology to Southeastern University, and he's the author of 13 books, including After Doubt and A Glorious Dark, Finding Hope in the Tension Between Belief and Experience. In his latest book, A Teachable Spirit, AJ's premise is that in a world characterized by distractions and endless content, it's essential to know how to learn and from whom we can learn. Teachability, AJ says, is the foundation of wisdom. What is teachability as you're using it?
Well, let's jump into it. Yeah. Well, I think there's two answers to that. One is probably a very personal one that has a little history in my life, and one is a longer theological one. On the personal side, on a personal level, I would say teachability are those rare moments in my life when I choose to put my pride and arrogance and ego to the side, and I let the Spirit of God say things to me that maybe I don't want to hear. On an academic, more theological side, I did a deep dive as I was writing A Teachable Spirit on the history of that word teachability, and found that it's actually very rarely used in the literature. And the earliest find that I could uncover of the use of the word teachability goes back to a sermon John Calvin gave on Deuteronomy chapter 10, which is a sermon in which Moses goes up the mountain and God tells Moses to bring with him some tablets that have no writing on them. And Calvin loved this sermon. And he said that when Moses brought these tablets up to the top of the mountain, God wrote on them. And he preached a whole sermon on how a part of being a Christian is, yes, what God writes, but part of it is you bringing the tablets of the mountain that God could write on. And it's this idea that in order for God to teach us something, in order for us to be teachable people, we actually have to bring something to be formed, to be shaped.
From the burning bush, O Lord, you charged me to bring the people to this holy mountain, to behold your glory and receive your law. What have I left undone?
That's Moses receiving the tablets of the law from a pyrotechnical god in Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 epic, The 10 Commandments. And epic is the right word. It's a mind-numbing 220 minutes, which rested very much on a more Christian culture's preparedness to sit through anything. Charlton Heston, of course, plays Moses, described in Numbers 12 as the most humble man who ever lived. Charlton Heston, though, is anything but. He's like the grumpy, serious Moses. But AJ says that humility is essential to the process of true learning, and it's something that Western culture has a particular struggle with. Is being teachable simply a Christian virtue, or is there something for my listeners who, aren't sure what to make of Christianity? Is teachability, something they should be aiming for?
I would hope, John, every human would be teachable on some level. I would say that is, Lord willing, part of the human story is that every human being, theologians talk about what we call the noetic effects of sin, which is that sin has the ability to make us self-centered, arrogant, hard-hearted, hard-minded.
Are there barriers to teachability that are peculiar to our Western moment?
Yes.
I'm thinking of, the proliferation of information, the culture wars, etc. But don't let me fill in the blanks. What do you reckon?
I had a friend tell me, Americans struggle to say three things. There are three phrases that Americans don't know how to say. We don't know how to say, I'm sorry. We don't know how to say, we don't know. And we don't know how to say Worcester sauce. And that third one's real hard. Most Americans, I can never, Worcester, I can't say it.
It's just Worcester.
Literally, I can't say it, Worcester sauce.
But once you've tasted it, there's no going back.
You never forget it, do you? There is something about Western culture that privileges and prioritizes arrogance. We love you'll see this in origin stories of famous companies like Apple or, companies that started in a garage. We deify the self-made prodigy who they were self-taught. They didn't need anybody to teach them. They were self-taught. This is why the internet is so dangerous for narcissists, because it gives us all the information we want, but we never have to tell people where we got it. So it's like the worst engine for narcissism, because we make it look like we know what we're talking about, when in reality, I just listened to a podcast yesterday and I'm just telling you everything I heard on that podcast. I think the point is, there is something in Western culture that prioritizes arrogance and a lack of humility.
So, a key to learning is humility. The logic is simple. People who imagine that they know most of what is important to know are kind of hermetically sealed from learning new things and receiving constructive criticism. I see this at conferences all the time. Every conference seems to have what you might call a proud Peter. He's the guy in your organization who is moderately talented and charming, but whose years of experience have created an inflexibility when it comes to learning from others or implementing changes. His natural wit is able to point out the smallest difficulty with a new idea, and so he quickly convinces himself, and sometimes others, that the old way, his way, is the best. Perhaps it's my imagination, but I think I can often spot the proud Peters in the audience when I address various groups. He typically sits up the back with arms folded or behind his head, and throughout the talk, he offers quips to his buddies. I can see it from stage, and they all politely smile back at him. He never takes notes. That would be just too keen. But he's frequently the first to raise his hand in the Q&A. I imagine he resists adopting any fresh insights. He's closed to new thoughts that aren't his own, and rarely submits himself to review or criticism. His pride impedes his progress. Arrogant managers, writes J.P. Cotter of the Harvard Business School, can over-evaluate their current performance and competitive position, listen poorly, and learn slowly. If my account sounds uncannily accurate, it's because proud Peter is probably my natural tendency. I frequently catch myself at conferences, when I'm not the speaker, thinking of quips and devising critiques. I also sit up the back. Then there's humble Heather. She's no less competent than Peter and no less confident. But she has a keen awareness that what she doesn't know and can't do far exceeds what she does know and can do. She has an attractive mix of steely will and intellectual gentleness. She's not as popular as Peter, but she has more friends. People trust her, respect her, they open up to her. And because she doesn't come off as intimidating, colleagues feel free to question her. And over the years, she's learnt never to resent this. Some of her best ideas came in a flash of insight after someone queried the wisdom of her first suggestion. At conferences, Heather sits neither at the back nor at the front. She's happy to go wherever her friends are. She takes notes. Heather follows the lecture so intently that the speaker, that's sometimes me, uses her as a gauge of how well the material is going over. She smiles, frowns, concentrates, and laughs. She whispers to those around her, but only, I imagine anyway, to confirm what's just been said with some anecdote of her own experience. She's just as likely as Peter to ask a public question, but her tone is different. She might look for clarification about something she didn't understand, or just wonder out loud how the material applies to her specific situation. Her motivation is to arrive at the truth, and she usually gets there. Her humility, in other words, often leads to new knowledge and methods. Now, in his book, Leading Change, Harvard's J.P. Cotter that I mentioned a moment ago explains how he tracked the careers of 115 of his former students at the Harvard Business School. He tells the story of Marcel, whom Cotter never really expected to show great leadership potential, but who emerged as head of his own company and became very, very successful. At first, Cotter wondered if the key was some lucky break that catapulted Marcel beyond his situation. But after discussion and reflection, he ended up attributing Marcel's success to the way he gave humble attention to the difficulties and mistakes he endured through the years. And I'm going to quote here from Cotter's book. He, that's Marcel, reflected on good times and bad and tried to learn from both. Confronting his mistakes, he minimized the arrogant attitudes that often accompany success. With a relatively humble view of himself, he watched more closely and listened more carefully than did most others. In other words, humility generates learning and growth. So, does that mean holding to a dogma, as the church is famous for doing, is an impediment to learning? I think it can be. So I asked AJ whether there is something inherently unhumble and therefore a block to learning in religious faith. Now, some might be listening to you and think, actually, dogma, like the whole idea of dogma, church dogma, is a barrier to learning because, and they would point to the church being slow to learn all sorts of things and being anti-education and so on.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything to that?
No, and we have conflated arrogance with dogmatism. Dogmatism is a gift. I want to be dogmatic. And what I mean by that is I want to be the kind of person that knows the difference between things that I'm open-handed about and things that I'm non-negotiable about. I am not open-minded about Jesus being the only way to God. I am not open-minded about whether Scripture is inspired. I'm not open-minded about whether there's a heaven and hell. I mean, I'm closed-minded on these things. But when you talk about the nature of angels and Nephilim and what UFOs are, I hold that a little bit more open-handedly. And you know what? It's only because I know the difference between dogma and opinion that I can actually hold that other stuff open-handedly. Because if I don't know what dogma is, I'm going to make everything a dogma. To actually hold to dogma means there are some things that are non-negotiable to me. I will die on a hill for. But there are other things I'm wildly open-handed about. There was a study, you probably heard this study, John, so forgive me for repeating something you may have heard, or your listener, but there was a really famous study that was done a number of years ago that studied fences around playgrounds, and it was a really interesting.
The study AJ's talking about here was conducted by Peter Summerlin, an associate of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Summerlin was interested in whether physical environments could be designed to promote the early development of children. And he arranged for teachers to take classes of preschool children to local playgrounds, some with fences and others with no barriers at all. In the unbounded playgrounds, children tended to be more cautious and huddled around the teacher. In fenced environments, though, children tended to be more comfortable and given to exploring their environment.
The study about when there's a playground at a school and there's no boundaries, there's no fence, the kids will play in the center. They won't go out. They'll play in the center and stick to the center. But if there's a fence, then the kids will fill in the entire space. And I actually think that dogma, theological boundaries, gives us the ability to be creative. It gives us freedom to actually disagree on things that aren't as important because we agree on the central things. So no, dogmatism and arrogance are not the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, everyone listening, whether they believe or not, should hope that a Christian was dogmatic about every human being made in the image of God, about sacrificial love being the center of ethics. Like, imagine if we were all dogmatic about those things.
Yeah. But of course, you know this. The problem is that the church often has bad PR. So the people who are arrogant get the microphone and don't steward those dogma positions with humility and kindness and grace. People in the last few years have been really mean to Tim Keller. There's been this kind of sort of
For those who don't know, Tim Keller was a brilliant American pastor and theologian who founded Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, and he wrote several New York Times best-selling books. Sadly, he died of pancreatic cancer in 2023. He was the public preacher I have admired most in the last 20 years, apart from all the other dead ones like Cyprian, Lactantius, Augustine, Alcuin of York, and so on. If you want to sample some of Keller's wisdom, just go to episode 63 of Undeceptions. It's just called With Keller. It was a great privilege to interview him before he died. Anyway, back to AJ.
Tim Keller. There's been this kind of sort of trash Tim Keller season. I don't know why. But I'll tell you what. Talk about a man who held faithfully the truths of the faith in a very hostile culture and did it winsomely, kindly, generously. There is a way to do this. And what stinks about it is often the church starts throwing rocks at you for being that way too. It's so weird that winsomeness has been weaponized as the problem. If we can't find a way to be humble about the things we're dogmatic about, we have no witness in our world today.
There is a fine line between fear and anger. Over the years, I have brought this lesson to my academic work on how religious people view science, and particularly how Christians, a community that I'm very concerned about and am part of, how Christians view science and scientists, and how scientists view religion and religious people. Fear can often masquerade as anger leading to conflict. And when we see conflict between faith and science, we need to get curious. We need to examine whether there might be underlying fear, and we need to try to understand that fear. And so take a pause just a minute with me and ask yourself, when it comes to connecting science and faith, science and religion, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of?
That's a good question. That's Professor Elaine Howard Eklund, a sociologist from Rice University, courtesy of the Veritas Forum. She's speaking on not just the compatibility of faith and science, but why faith and science actually need each other. Her point is that this need is often overlooked because of the fear that we might lose if we allowed faith and science to work together. And it's a fear that's as much in religious communities as it is in scientific communities. We'll put a link to her full talk in the show notes, but that sort of fear has on occasion resulted in white-hot anger in Christian circles towards secular knowledge that seems to contradict Bible teaching. As a result, there's a sort of anti-intellectualism that has stained some parts of evangelicalism for almost a century. When experts seem to disagree with the Bible, we should distrust the experts. Or as 20th century American evangelist Billy Sunday is credited with saying, when the Word of God says one thing and scholarship says another, scholarship can go to hell. Some would say that evangelicalism, and in particular US evangelicalism, has been anti-intellectual and therefore, unteachable in another way. Would you agree? Is it getting better? I'm thinking of the famous Mark Knoll thesis.
Yep. It was so interesting.
Just to interrupt myself, Dr. Mark Knoll is a specialist in the history of Christianity. He's research professor at Regent College. We interviewed him for the first hymn. He's wonderful. One of his most influential works is called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. In it, he explores a disconnect between faith and reason brought on by a failure in the evangelical community to engage intellectually. At least in the US, he says. It's quite different in Britain. This phenomenon, he says, includes a neglect of intellectual pursuits, a focus on personal experience over theological depth, and a tendency to prioritize cultural relevance over sound doctrine. Knoll writes, "The scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind." Ouch.
It was so interesting when I did, in America, we get into fights about everything. We just have found a way to create cottage industries of fights about everything in the world. And then we create communities over the little tiny things that we agree about or disagree about. And grievance becomes the glue of our culture. It's what holds everything together, because if we can grieve about certain things, find grievance, then we can create a community about it. When I was doing my PhD at the University of Birmingham in Britain, I was writing on how Christians think about the environment. And I was writing specifically about theological perspectives, biblical theological perspectives on caring for creation. I'm a deep believer that God's people are called to care for God's garden. It's God's garden. It's not ours. And we don't get to treat it like it's our garden. It's His. And it was so interesting in being just over the pond, as it were, being in Britain, is in America, when you talk about creation, the immediate conversation is about how old the earth is, which I think is a very important conversation. Don't get me wrong. It's a very important conversation that we should get into get into a good debate about. But what I found was that the topic of creation was so politicized that we couldn't talk about it because it became a political conversation. Whereas in Britain, there is no debate over whether we should care for creation or not. It's not even a conversation. It's like it's baked into the system. I don't know. And that the difference between those two, to me, just illustrates one of the sicknesses of American evangelicalism, is that we take issues that Scripture speaks blatantly about, and addresses it head on. This is God's garden, and we treat it as God's garden. We take an issue like that, and then all of a sudden put it into the political realm, and now we can't have any conversations about it because we've made it into who's right and who's wrong. The Christian cares more about truth than they do about being right. And I think the American spirit is we're more interested in being right than the truth. There is something baked into the culture here that is very dangerous to the human soul.
So, how do we avoid the pitfalls and become teachable people? The answer is the same for skeptics as it is for people of faith. We have to develop a preparedness, a humility to learn from others, that scaffolding thing again. There are some neglected teachers AJ wants us to learn from, and some of them we won't even like. So stay with us. This episode of Undeceptions is sponsored by Zondervan Academic, and I wanted to tell you about one of their new books, Prophet, Priest and King, edited by respected scholars Michael Horton, Elizabeth Mburu and Justin Holcomb. You've no doubt heard the way that Christianity is sometimes dismissed as a Western, even a white man's religion. But that's just not true. From its beginnings in the Middle East, then through Africa, Asia, and Latin America today, Christianity is very often non-white. It is a profoundly global movement. Prophet, Priest, and King demonstrates this beautifully. The book gathers the work of majority world theologians, looking at Jesus through three ancient roles: the prophet, the priest, and the king. What's fascinating is how each culture sees something fresh, sometimes things we in the West have completely overlooked. Seeing Jesus through the eyes of someone from an entirely different culture from our own really helps us round out the picture of who Jesus really is. Billions of people across cultures find Jesus compelling. And while plenty of people see Christianity as hopelessly divided, this book helps point out the unified testimony of the global church about the central figure of Christianity. You can find Prophet, Priest and King on Amazon, and you can get a sample chapter of the book at zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions. zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions.
Wendy and Jamie live just a few blocks from the school. Unless the weather is bad, they walk to and from school every day. Sometimes there are interesting things to do or see on the way home from school. All children love puppies. Grown-ups know this and will usually let them pet or play with a puppy. They may even offer to give it to the children as a gift.
Don't accept gifts from strangers.
It is the next day. Wendy and Jamie are on their way to school, and they have occasion to remember another one of the safety rules. A lady in a beautiful car says she is going past the school and will be glad to give them a ride.
Don't accept rides from strangers.
Man, that's creepy. You should see the footage. Maybe we'll put a link in the show notes. It's from a 1963 educational school film titled Say No to Strangers. You'll be weirded out by the man in the bow tie who tries to give Wendy and Jamie a puppy. It served a serious purpose, though, I suppose. Children have to learn to be safe around people they don't know. But should we carry this stranger danger vibe into all areas of adulthood? AJ reckons we've done that. We've developed an unhealthy culture of mistrust toward the stranger. But in fact, they have a lot to teach us. You talk about learning from strangers. What's the special value of learning from a stranger?
There was a book I read a number of years ago that was about the topic of what the internet has done to our learning, and this particular author was talking about how we can now find whatever we're looking for immediately. So, like, if I want to find any information about anything, I can find it immediately. Now, go back 30 years. I couldn't search Google for who the president of the United States was, in 1850. I couldn't Google who the shortstop of the New York Mets was in 1955. I had to do research. I had to go read books. I had to go to the library. And when you read, about something you're trying to find, all of a sudden you have to read a whole book in order to find the information you're looking for. And along the way, you end up learning all the stuff you were not looking for. Alan Jacobs, Baylor University, he calls that serendipitous knowledge. And serendipitous knowledge, it's the knowledge that you get that you weren't looking for. Here's what strangers do. Time and time and time again, I have found that in conversations with strangers, just people I don't know, people on the bus, people, on the street that I'm talking to, students of mine that I don't know, is that they don't have the assumptions that I have. They don't come with the same beliefs I have. They don't come with the same worldview that I have. And they say things that I'm not looking for. I am confronted by somebody who does not share at all my life. And that serendipity, that serendipitous knowledge, how many times does Jesus in the Emmaus Road story appears as a stranger to the disciples? Disciples, right, they welcome him in and realize this stranger, is God. But it's by welcoming the stranger that the revelation is possible. I think there's something to be said about that Christ loves to use surprising sources to confront us in our bubbles. Because we all live in bubbles. We can now create bubbles for ourselves. But strangers do not say, they don't think what I want them to say and think. This does not mean that every stranger is right, nor does it mean that every stranger is safe. You've got to be discerning. But reading, listening to, talking to people you don't know may end up actually popping that bubble and help you to see things in a perspective you never could have imagined before. I think strangers are awesome. They're terrifying. And I'm an introvert. And I'd prefer to live in a room and read Karl Barth all day. But at the end of the day, strangers help me.
What is it? What do you see?
I see shapes of men. And of horses.
Where?
Pale banners like shreds of cloud. Spears ride like winter thickets through a shroud of mist. The dead are following. They have been summoned.
The dead? Summoned? I knew that. Very good. Very good. Legolas!
That's Legolas and Gimli walking the paths of the dead in a scene from The Return of the King. Its sense of horror is based on successfully evoking a very common feeling in cinemagoers. In the West, we often have an aversion to walking the paths of the dead, talking or even thinking about death. And we seem to have a bias against listening to the dead too. They're in the past, right? What could they teach us? We're in the age of iPhone and AI. We're the pinnacle But the dead, they're behind us, and so they're beneath us. But that wasn't the case in the early church. Something I experienced firsthand when I visited the catacombs of Priscilla during the filming of the Centre for Public Christianity's For the Love of God film. There were clearly wealthy and powerful people among the first Christians. You can tell from the size and style of their burial chambers. The astonishing thing is that they are buried right alongside the poor and lowly, with no barriers between them.
They saw themselves as family in life. And here the high and the low lie side by side in death.
One of the history tours I run through Greece and Rome includes an hour or so in the catacombs of St. Sebastian. It's one of those 2nd or 3rd century places where Christians provided Romans a place to bury their dead, in a world where you could just as easily end up on a rubbish heap or in the river as in a grave. And these underground paths of the dead were where Christians worshipped and prayed and reflected. They maintained their bonds with the dead. After all, according to Christian theology, we'll be reunited with the dead in the resurrection. The dead are our friends. The dead can be our teachers. You also say that we should be learning from the dead. I mean, that's a particular kind of stranger, I guess. This is hard for moderns, isn't it? Because we've got this idea of the progression of knowledge. So learning from someone, who's been dead 100 years is sort of difficult to see the wisdom of it. But you make the case. So I'm giving you the opportunity to make the case for learning from the dead.
Well, there's a Roman Catholic scholar named Jaroslav Pelikan who once famously said that tradition is the living faith of the dead, and traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And his point is that actually tradition is a gift to the church. Listening to what the church has thought and taught and believed for 2,000 years makes you a really wise person. I also would say, as a Protestant, tradition in the church has sometimes been wrong. We follow Scripture above tradition, and we would say Scripture is the final say. But tradition provides so much wisdom and insight and life. One of the problems I'm seeing, John, in my world is that for most evangelicals, most Protestants, we understand sainthood in a very different way than our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters would. Saints are not dead people who have done a couple miracles who have been tested and tried. Saints, in our circle, too often are people that have sold the most books and have the biggest churches. And the problem with our modern evangelical view of sainthood is that when we attach our faith to somebody whose story is not complete yet, we end up putting ourselves in damage of strapping ourselves to things that could... I think this is why we're seeing a lot of people deconstruct their faith, because they've strapped their faith more to their youth pastor than they do St. Athanasius in the 4th century. And my point is, I think that we should strap our faith not just to the living, but to the history of the church.
Athanasius of Alexandria, a bit of a hero from the 4th century, led the charge in the battle against Arianism. That's the idea that Jesus was a created being who was only a little bit like God, not the same substance as God. Friend of the pod, C.S. Lewis, wrote an introduction to Athanasius's work on the Incarnation that not only emphasized the importance of learning from the dead, it provided some helpful hints about how to do this. Now, I love this introduction.
There is a strange idea abroad that in every subject the ancient books should be read only by the professionals, and that the amateur should content himself with the modern books. Thus I have found as a tutor in English literature that if the average student wants to find out something about Platonism, the very last thing he thinks of doing is to take a translation of Plato off the library shelf and read the Symposium. He would rather read some dreary modern book 10 times as long, all about isms and influences, and only once in 12 pages telling him what Plato actually said. The error is rather an amiable one, for it springs from humility. The student is half afraid to meet one of the great philosophers face to face. He feels himself inadequate and thinks he will not understand him. But if he only knew, the great man, just because of his greatness, is much more intelligible than his modern commentator. Naturally, since I myself am a writer, I do not wish the ordinary reader to read no modern books. But if he must read only the new or only the old, I would advise him to read the old. And I would give him this advice precisely because he is an amateur, and therefore much less protected than the expert against the dangers of an exclusive contemporary diet. A new book is still on its trial, and the amateur is not in a position to judge it. It has to be tested against the great body of Christian thought down the ages, and all its hidden implications, often unsuspected by the author himself, have to be brought to light. Often it cannot be fully understood without the knowledge of a good many other modern books. If you join at 11 o'clock a conversation which began at 8, you will often not see the real bearing of what is said. It is a good rule after reading a new book never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones. C.S. Lewis, Introduction to On the Incarnation.
I think that's a good piece of wisdom because we are naively committed to new things being truer and better. It's called presentism, recency bias. Lewis called it chronological snobbery. We think that because it's new, it's right. Well, friends, you don't have to work very hard to figure out that just because it's new does not make it right in any way, shape, or form. So we need a broader context for understanding truth other than just the living.
And that doesn't just apply to the church, right? Society tends to reject tradition as well, but could learn from its own secular traditions. Do you agree?
That's a great question. And yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm obviously uniquely interested and focused on developing kind of a Christian understanding of learning from the dead. But in general, Western culture has been almost uncritically believed the idea that if it is, I mean, even Google, when you Google something, it will give you the latest results at the very top. It's assuming the newest stuff is always right. And that's a weird assumption. I mean, just one, I would say for a secular person or a Christian, we should ask ourselves the question, why do we assume that? Now, there would be some who would say the opposite, that if it's old, it's true. And I think we could both agree, John, that's an equally unhealthy perspective towards truth. And so truth is not exclusive to its moment in history. It's eternal. It stands outside of time. And sometimes the old, sometimes the new, get a good perspective on it.
Another great old mind worth paying attention to on this subject is the essayist and novelist Gilbert Keith Chesterton. That's GK. We've absolutely got to do an episode on GK. I hope, Kaley, you've got that slated. Thank you. Anyway, Chesterton wrote that paying close attention to tradition, to the democracy of the dead, as he called it, was a way of expanding our limited cognitive horizons. Take it away, GK.
There is one thing that I have never from my youth up been able to understand. I have never been able to understand where people got the idea that democracy was in some way opposed to tradition. It is obvious that tradition is only democracy extended through time. It is trusting to a consensus of common human voices, rather than to some isolated or arbitrary record. Those who urge against tradition, that men in the past were ignorant, may go and urge it at the Carlton Club, along with the statement that voters in the slums are ignorant. It will not do for us. If we attach great importance to the opinion of ordinary men in great unanimity when we are dealing with daily matters, there is no reason why we should disregard it when we are dealing with history or fable. Tradition may be defined as an extension of the franchise. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking around. All Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by the accident of death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our groom. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father. I, at any rate, cannot separate the two ideas of democracy and tradition. It seems evident to me that they are the same idea. We will have the dead at our councils. The ancient Greeks voted by stones. These shall vote by tombstones. G.K. Chesterton, Orthodoxy.
The Church has occasionally displayed an unhealthy suspicion of experts, living or dead. For our Undeceptions pluses, I asked AJ what he would say to the Christian who doubted the value of deep learning. For the rest of us, learning from the dead, learning from strangers. Next, learning from our enemies. Most of us picture Bali as beaches and sunshine. Oh, so many Aussies go there. But away from the resorts, many families struggle to provide even the basics for their children. And that's why I'm so encouraged by Anglican Aid's Project Bali. They're caring for more than 300 kids who can't live at home. They give them food, medical care, education, and Christian community. One 14-year-old boy named Gara said, "I now have the opportunity to study, to play, and to dream again." And you can help more children just like Gara by visiting anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions. That's anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions to make a tax-deductible gift today. Please help these guys out.
Just you wait, Henry Higgins, just you wait. You'll be sorry, but your tears will be too late. You'll be broke and all have money. Will I help you, damn be funny? Just you wait, Henry Higgins, just you wait. Just you wait, Henry Higgins, till you're sick. And you screams to fetch a doctor double quick. I'll be off a second later and go straight to the theatre. Ha ha, Henry Higgins, just you wait.
The cinematic classic My Fair Lady, based on the George Bernard Shaw play Pygmalion. It's a story of opposites, where Sir Rex Harrison plays Professor Henry Higgins, a phonetics expert who bets he can transform a Cockney flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, into a true lady, played by the mesmerising Audrey Hepburn. And that song, Just You Wait, is the only song Hepburn really mostly sings. All of the really tuneful stuff in the film was dubbed by Marnie Nixon because the music director thought Hepburn's voice didn't quite cut it. My Fair Lady is, at its heart, a story of two people from opposite ends of the social spectrum. They are class enemies who end up learning from each other. Eliza learns, well, manners and to speak real good, but also she learns that she actually has gifts and independence. And Higgins learns not to be a jerk and to look to the humanity of others. It's a little cute, a little predictable, but there's something here for all of us. You take this to an extreme by insisting that we learn from enemies, that enemies have a special role in being our tutors.
Yes, it's funny because of all the chapters, this is the one that people scratch their head the most. In fact, one of my endorsers basically said to me when he was endorsing the book, which he happily endorsed it, but he said, AJ, you got to be cautious. I've never heard a Christian argue we should learn from our enemies. I mean, that is a weird, and to my response to that is actually it's built into our history. The early church, it turns out, I'll give you a great example of this. The early church, in 1945, there was a series of documents, a set of archaeological finds called the Nag Hammadi texts. They were some of the most important, ancient, non-authoritative Orthodox writings in archaeological history. And it was a series of Gnostic writings. They were not Orthodox. They were not a part of the original, New Testament writings. They were not accepted by the church. So when these were found, this is so interesting. They took the Nag Hammadi texts, the gospel infancy of Jesus, of Thomas, the gospel of Thomas, these writings, when they compared the Nag Hammadi texts with the early church fathers who were Orthodox, the folks that were proclaiming the truth, Athanasius, Irenaeus, Augustine, they found two things that were really interesting. Number one is it was very clear that the Orthodox, the true theologians were actually reading the writings of the people that they disagreed with. So they were actually they knew what the heretics believed. They read their works. They were familiar with their works. They engaged with their works. This was even more interesting. The early church fathers, when they would quote the Gnostic writers, would always quote them faithfully down to the T, meaning they did not misrepresent their enemies because they believed even the enemy deserved to be honored. You don't twist their words to win a point. You honor their words to dismantle what they think. I think the earliest Christian witness shows us that the only way that you can confront falsehood is you need to know the falsehood.
The Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and others, are not actually written by Thomas, Philip, Mary, etc. We've spoken a bit about this before in episodes, but the Gnostic writers emphasized personal spiritual revelation over Orthodox historic Christianity, and the contents of their Gospels are not so much history as divine knowledge secretly revealed. AJ's point is that the early Christian critics of the Gnostics at least read those heretical works and had true things to say about them. Actually, some of the great church fathers, like Augustine, insisted that we should read beyond our own tribe. He famously recommended that Christians plunder the Egyptians, that was his expression. Take the good things from any literature, regardless of the sub-Christian source.
If those who are called philosophers, and especially the Platonists, have said anything that is true and in harmony with our faith, we are not only not to shrink from it, but to claim it for our own use from those who have unlawful possession of it. For as the Egyptians had not only the idols and heavy burdens which the people of Israel hated and fled from, but also vessels and ornaments of gold and silver, and garments, which the same people when going out of Egypt appropriated to themselves, designing them for a better use, not doing this on their own authority, but by the command of God, the Egyptians themselves, in their ignorance, providing them with things which they themselves were not making a good use of. In the same way, all branches of heathen learning have not only false and superstitious fancies and heavy burdens of unnecessary toil, which every one of us, when going out under the leadership of Christ from the fellowship of the heathen, ought to abhor and avoid. But they contain also liberal instruction, which is better adapted to the use of the truth, and some most excellent precepts of morality, and some truths in regard even to the worship of the one God are found among them. Saint Augustine, on Christian Doctrine.
Augustine wasn't alone in thinking this. Ancient and medieval Christian leaders were far more liberal, in the best sense, in their reading and learning than we often imagine. Cassiodorus was an Italian statesman and then a scholar monk in the 500s AD, so about a century after Augustine. He did his best to collect manuscripts of the best Christian and pagan writings, and then he created a little group of monks to copy them and study them. His most important work was called Institutions of Divine and Secular Learning. The title gives it away. It's amazing. It's basically a great books program of study that he recommended for all Christian instructors so that they could teach the faith intelligently to everyone. It's broken into 2 books, and Book 1 lists and comments on all the Christian books that someone should read. And it includes deep theological works, biblical commentaries, and even some geographical studies on biblical lands. It's incredible to think that all that had been written in the first 400 years of Christianity. And then, in Book 2, he lists and comments on all the secular pagan, that's Greek and Roman works that people should be reading. And there are tons of them, broken up into all the different topics. Books on grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, music, geometry, astronomy. Then there's Photius I. He's the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 9th century. He's roughly the Eastern equivalent of the Western Pope. Sorry, my Catholic friends aren't going to like that. But anyway, go with me. Photius left us some notes about his own recommended reading in a document known as the Bibliotheca. In it, he summarizes and reviews, cop this, 380 books that he reckons everyone should be reading. 233 of these are Christian works, like Eusebius, Athanasius, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and so on. But 147 of them are pagan or secular works, including Herodotus, Arrian, Plutarch, Philostratus, and so on. He frequently notes his disagreement with an author, whether pagan or Christian, but he still recommends the reading of each one. Learn from everyone. That was his basic vibe.
Now, here's the deal. Don't assume when I say learn from your enemies, that does not mean they're right. In the Western world, we assume learning from somebody means we agree with them. Those are not the same thing. I learn from people all the time I disagree with. So to be able to learn from somebody does not imply agreement, just as washing someone's feet does not mean you agree with them. Jesus washed Judas's feet, for heaven's sake, right before he got him crucified. So yes, should we learn from people we disagree with? If Jesus tells us to pray for our enemies and love our enemies, goodness gracious, shouldn't we also learn from them? And sometimes I think by learning from our enemies, it actually creates an opportunity for conversation where I'm able to share the good news of Jesus with them. But if I'm unwilling to learn from them, why should I expect them to learn anything from me?
Let's press pause. I've got a 5-minute Jesus for you. Here's a strange thought. We know Jesus was a famous teacher, arguably the most influential teacher in world history. But was he also a learner, a student? I think the answer has to be yes. There are the obvious simple things, like Jesus had to learn his own language, right? Aramaic. He probably also learned some Hebrew and even Greek. I don't think we're meant to imagine that the 2-year-old Jesus knew the entire Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek dictionaries and grammar books. Even though the Christian faith regards him as fully divine from the beginning, equally, Christianity insists he was fully human. And this means there had to be human limitations. I mean, Jesus could fall over and hurt himself, and his body would have to heal. There were things he didn't know and had to be taught by others. In this same category, I think you'd have to put carpentry. Jesus was a carpenter's son, right? He would have taken on that work from a very young age, so he had to learn as an apprentice from his father. There are some crazy stories written more than 100 years after Jesus, where Christians imagined the boy Jesus could make bits of wood lengthen and shorten at will, but these have no historical basis, and I think those texts downplay the important doctrine that Jesus was fully human. There's one line in the Gospels that indicates we're on the right track in thinking that Jesus was a learner before he was a teacher. In Luke chapter 2, there's this wonderful quirky story about the 12-year-old Jesus who gets separated from mum and dad when they're at the festival in Jerusalem. Mary eventually finds the boy Jesus, and then we're told that Jesus went home and was obedient to them. But the chapter ends with this strange statement: Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. That's interesting. Obviously, Jesus grew in stature. That probably just means he moved towards adulthood. But what about growing in wisdom? Wisdom is the standard word for knowing important things about God's world. We are told that Jesus grew, prokopto, in wisdom. And this word grow, prokopto, means exactly what it sounds like. It means to increase, to progress. Luke is telling us that the boy Jesus developed in knowledge, just as he developed into adulthood. And according to most Jesus scholars, we probably know the name of Jesus' main influencer, the one who helped him grow in wisdom. John the Baptist. Now, it may be too much to say, as some scholars do say, like Kurt Rudolph of the University of Marburg, that Jesus was a disciple of John the Baptist in the strict sense. But the evidence does indicate that of all the Jewish teachers active in Judea and Galilee in this period, the Baptist was the one Jesus most admired and identified with before he launched his own teaching mission to Israel. Paula Fredrickson of Boston University describes the scholarly consensus best when she says, "What we do know past doubting is that John had a crucially important impact on Jesus." Several bits of evidence point in this direction. First is the simple fact that John's ministry predates that of Jesus. We don't know how long John had been baptizing people in the Jordan River before Jesus went public, but it's certain that his career was well established prior to AD 28, when Jesus chose to be baptized. And here is the second indicator. It's clear Jesus submitted himself publicly to John's defining ritual. Remember, baptism was John's ministry before it was the ministry of Jesus and the church. In the words of Mark's Gospel, at that time Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. For Christians, of course, Jesus' baptism by John is such a well-known feature of the Gospel story that few pause to think what it must have meant at the time. While it's true that John came to regard Jesus as the greater of the two, the fact that Jesus chose to be baptized by John also indicates that he saw the Baptist's particular vision of life as the starting point, as the launching pad for his own preaching. And it's also interesting, thirdly, that at least two of Jesus' first disciples came from the circle of John's disciples. In John chapter 1, we're told that one of them was the apostle Andrew, brother of the chief apostle Peter, and the other isn't named. This does imply a real overlap between John and Jesus, a kind of handing on the baton, perhaps, as the apprentice now becomes the master. And just as revealing, fourthly and finally, is that Jesus inherited John's practice of baptism. All of this points in one direction for the majority of scholars today. No more likely candidate for Jesus' mentor emerges from the record than John the Baptist. Much of Jesus' later ministry maintains the emphases of the Baptist. His continuation of the baptism ritual, as I said, his frequent warnings of imminent judgment, his passionate plea that people return to their Maker, and his promise of forgiveness of sins for those who repent. All of these reflect the teachings of Jesus' mentor. But Jesus wasn't a carbon copy of John. Far from it. A text from Luke, that's also repeated in Matthew, reveals one very obvious way in which Jesus departed from John, from his mentor. Whereas John wandered in the wilderness living as an ascetic, Jesus toured the towns and villages eating and drinking with all and sundry. And both men were criticized for it by the establishment. Here's the text. "For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man," that's Jesus, "came eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." That's Luke 7 and Matthew 11. At this point, Jesus has fully grown in wisdom. And he takes things in a very different direction from John the Baptist. The Baptist emphasized imminent disaster and demanded asceticism, at least for himself. Jesus continued to preach judgment, but he went around eating and drinking, inviting those you might have thought were first in line for judgment to his table of friendship. Jesus has now surpassed his mentor. The learner has become the teacher, and history would never be the same. You can press play now. Okay, so that's the Christian listener. What might you say to the more secular listener who doubts there's anything for them to learn from the Christian tradition? I mean, we've got science and AI. What do we need, you guys?
Yeah, I would say look at your arrogance. Isn't it weird? Don't you find it weird that if you're a secular academic, that if a pastor preached a sermon and quoted the literature of some of the smartest secular people in the world, that makes you sound really smart? But if a really brilliant secular academic quotes a pastor in their academic paper, they won't get it published. And my point is, isn't it weird that we live in a context where it is almost like we're not allowed to learn from the church? It's almost as though the church has nothing to offer the world. And I would just ask, where's that arrogance come from? Because that is arrogance. And at the end of the day, you don't actually believe in truth. You believe in truth as it's politically motivated, as long as it fits within your political motivations. I'm a believer that the church has a witness to the truth that is unique, and there is something to be learned by people who are true learners to learn from even the church.
And that's AJ's point, really. No one is above learning, not even the academic who everyone goes to learn from. Learning from beginning to end is an exercise in humility. It's something AJ learned firsthand in a kind of real-life parable. Listen to this. At the very beginning of your book, you tell the story of the Phillips head screwdriver. And I would just love that on tape so that we can use it at some point. Tell us the parable of the screwdriver.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's probably the most vulnerable part of the book. And I decided to put it at the very front end because I know just so many people that experience this sort of reality in their life. So I'm kind of my backstory. I didn't have as a grown up, didn't have a dad that was super present. And so as a result of that, a lot of the things that young boys get with a really super present dad is I didn't get a lot of those things. And I wasn't, ever taught how to build things or, fix a car or, do quote unquote man things that men are supposed to do. So a number of years ago, my wife and our son wanted a treehouse. And so we started building a treehouse in our backyard. And it was our house had gotten too small and he was grown up. He was like 4 or 5 years old. He needed something outside to do. And so we were out starting to build this treehouse. And my wife had this beautiful vision for it. She's kind of the builder in our family. And she said to me, we're out there, I'm holding up this piece of wood to go up to the tree. And she says, can you go to the garage and get me a Phillips head screwdriver? And I said, sure. So I go to the garage and I'm going through the tools, and as if from nowhere, it came out of nowhere, John, I just started to feel these waves of emotions and I just began to cry. It was this weird, is this a midlife crisis sort of? I honestly, it was an enigma. And I sat down and all of a sudden it dawned on me. I didn't know what a Phillips head screwdriver looked like. Nobody had ever taught me what a Phillips head screwdriver was. And I'm sitting there in this pile of shame because I knew I was going to have to go back and tell my wife, I don't know what it is because I never had a dad who taught me. And by the grace of God, dude, I went back, I told her, I was of tears coming down my face. I said, I don't know what a Phillips head screwdriver. And she was so gentle and so kind and came and showed me. And, she's taught me some of the tools these days. I know what a Phillips head screwdriver is now.
I bet you're an expert now.
I know all Phillips head screwdrivers. But here's what what I experienced in that moment was not shame specifically as much as it was shame for not knowing something I was supposed to know. And I think when I teach my intro to the Bible class at the university, I always tell that story because there are students who are Christians in the class who feel so much shame that they don't know the Bible the way that they think that they're supposed to because nobody ever taught it to them. And part of learning, being a learner, being a teachable person, is first confronting the shame that we are not the people we thought we should have been, and acknowledging that and letting the grace of Christ meet us right in the middle of that shame. It's true. None of us are the people that we should be, but that is exactly the kind of person that Jesus Christ loves to work with.
AJ, thank you so much for your time. If you like what we're doing, there are a bunch of things you can do to really help us out. You can go to Apple Podcasts and give us a review. Or you can go to undeceptions.com and pick up one of our t-shirts from the store. You can become an Undeceptions Plus subscriber and get access to a bunch of extras and our special Facebook group. And if you really want to help our team, please consider making a donation. Go to undeceptions.com, click the oversized yellow donate button and see where the wind blows. While you're there, send us a question by audio or text and I'll try and answer it in the upcoming Q&A episode. See ya. Undeceptions is hosted by me, John Dickson, produced by Kaley Payne and directed by Mark Hadley. Alasdair Belling is a writer and researcher. Siobhan McGuiness is our online librarian. Lindy Leviston remains my wonderful assistant. Santino DeMarco is Chief Finance and Operations Consultant. Editing by Richard Humwee. Our voice actor today was Suzanne Ellis. Special thanks to our series sponsor Zondervan for making this Undeception possible. Undeceptions is the flagship podcast of undeceptions.com, letting the truth out. An Undeceptions podcast.